Black box record, USS Valiant, last transmitted coordinates, Sector 57K. Mission status, irreversible loss.
Request confirmation. A ship that disappeared 20 years ago has returned without a trace of time. It's as if it never left.
The crew's back. They look like humans. They're not them. They're not the ones who left 20 years ago. We asked them what happened. They said nothing. That it had only been 32 days. But
you understand, Dr. Hessler. If we're back, that means we've always been here.
There was no sound, no sensation, just the quiet weight of something vast pressing in at the edges of my mind, something that had no name, no shape, but carried intent. I should have been gone, should have slipped away as Kalen had, as Langley had, should have unraveled, piece by piece, into whatever void had claimed them. And yet something held me here. Not presence, not will, something else. I opened my eyes, or thought I did. The concept of seeing felt wrong, disconnected from the mechanics of a body I wasn't even sure I still had. Space stretched before me in a way that defied form, a shifting plane of dark and pale echoes, angles that bent in ways my brain refused to process. It wasn't empty, yet it contained nothing I could recognize. It was as if I stood within the negative space between two realities, and the moment I became aware of it, it became aware of me. The pressure increased, pushing against my skull, threading through the cracks in my understanding, trying to shape itself into something my mind could grasp. It wanted me to see it, to know it, but in a way that bypassed my own comprehension entirely. Not language, not voice, imposition. I turned, though I wasn't sure I still had the capacity to move. And there he was, Langley, or what was left of him. He was frozen in place mid-motion, his body locked in a half-step backward, his mouth still slightly open from the last thing he had tried to say. His eyes were wide, too wide, the irises stretched just past what should have been physically possible. But he wasn't breathing, and I didn't think he ever had been. I reached for him, but my fingers met nothing. No resistance, no temperature, not even the static displacement of two objects existing in the same space. I concentrated, focusing on every memory I had of him. His voice, his presence, the way he used to tap his fingers against the console in frustration. And as I did, something shifted. The Langley before me flickered, not like a glitch, like a thought being corrected. The truth came like a slow, terrible realization settling into my bones. I knew Langley. I had worked with him for years. We had studied together, trained together. But when I tried to grasp the details, the edges of my memories blurred. When had we met? When had he joined the Anomaly Response Division? I could recall his voice, but not a single conversation in full. I could see his face, but I couldn't picture the moment we first shook hands. Like remembering a dream that had never actually happened. The Langley before me wasn't just dead. He had never been real at all. I stepped back, my pulse hammering in my skull. If I still had a skull, if I still had a pulse. The pressure around me deepened, pushing against the boundaries of my mind, probing for gaps, searching for purchase. It wasn't just trying to break me, it was trying to fix me. I clenched my hands into fists, focusing on sensation. Pain was real. Pain was grounding. I dug my nails into my palm, felt the bite of pressure, the sharp sting anchoring me to something tangible. And just like that, I was standing in the corridor again. The station had reassembled around me. The emergency lights flickered overhead, casting long, stuttering shadows across the floor. The walls, the doors, the panels, all perfectly in place. No cracks in reality, no shifting angles. Just the station, just the world I knew. But it wasn't right. I could feel it in the air, in the weight of my own body. The sensation was too even, too measured, like stepping into a replica of a place that had once been real. There were no imperfections, no scuffs on the floor, no faint hum of failing machinery. Even the air smelled too clean. It was a world built from memory, not reality. I turned, and they were waiting for me. Monroe stood at the front, his uniform as crisp as the day he had launched. The others flanked him in perfect symmetry, their faces composed, their hands at their sides. No movement, no shifting weight, and no breath. "You're not supposed to be here," Monroe said. His voice was calm, even, unbothered. Like I was an unexpected variable in an otherwise flawless equation. Like I was a mistake. And for a moment, a brief, terrible moment, I heard myself respond. I never left. The words weren't mine, but they had come from my mouth. Monroe nodded, satisfied. The crew behind him blinked in unison, their movements so perfectly synchronized it sent a crawling sensation through my skin. Something was pressing against my thoughts again, a weight settling inside my skull, not forcing itself in, but making space. They were rewriting me, and if I let them, I wouldn't even notice when it was complete. I forced my hands into fists, trying to focus on the sensation. But the moment was slipping, the edges of my thoughts softening as if something was smoothing them down, making space where there shouldn't be any. My breath hitched, not from fear, but from the terrible realization that I wasn't sure if I had been breathing at all since stepping into this place. I looked at Monroe, at his men, at the thing that used to be the crew of the Valiant. They stood in perfect symmetry, hands resting loosely at their sides, backs straight, shoulders squared, their uniforms pristine. Not a single wrinkle, not a sign of wear or use, as if they had just been issued moments ago, fresh from storage. And yet, they had been wearing them for 32 days. Or 20 years. Monroe watched me with an expression that held just enough humanity to be unsettling. Measured, patient, expectant. He knew something I didn't. They all did. "You resist," Monroe said, his voice devoid of curiosity, as if the observation was only relevant in the way a machine logs an unexpected output. I swallowed, my throat dry. "Because I know what you are." Something flickered behind his gaze, but it wasn't recognition. It was like watching a system run a recalibration, assessing, adjusting, preparing a response. His head tilted, a fraction too slow. "We are what we have always been," he said. The words felt rehearsed. Not from memory, but from function. I shook my head, stepping back. The movement felt wrong, my body heavier than it should have been, the air pressing against me in subtle, shifting resistance. The station still wasn't right. Nothing was right. I ran my tongue across my teeth, testing my own physicality, making sure I could still feel something real. "You're not them," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You're copies, imperfect ones." Again, that slight flicker behind his eyes. Not surprise, just adjustment. "You assume error," he said. I hesitated. "Are you saying there isn't one?" Monroe's expression didn't change. He glanced at his men, and as if responding to a silent cue, they all nodded in unison. It was the same movement I had seen before, in the quarantine chamber, when they agreed that only 32 days had passed. The synchronization was too perfect, the delay between cause and effect too precise. It wasn't natural. It wasn't human. I forced myself to keep breathing, my mind racing to process the implications. If they weren't the Valiant's crew, if they weren't even close enough to pass as real, then what were they? What had happened to the original men? And what had returned in their place? I took another step back, glancing toward the hallway that led to the control room. If I could reach the emergency override panel, I could force a full station lockdown, cut the oxygen supply to the quarantine chambers, trigger a purge cycle. Monroe took a single step forward. I froze. He didn't move like a man. He didn't shift his weight, didn't adjust for balance. His foot came forward, and the rest of him simply followed, as if the concept of walking had only just occurred to him. His men followed suit, a half step behind. The movement was staggered, but only mathematically, like a function executing the same command with slight variations to prevent redundancy. The pressure in my skull deepened. "You are incomplete," Monroe said. The words sent a pulse of something sharp through my head. Not pain, not sound, but correction, like a note being tuned. I clenched my jaw. "I'm not the one that's wrong here. You were always meant to be," he continued, as if I hadn't spoken. "We are as we were made. You will be too." The last syllable dragged, as if the word had weight, substance, something deeper than meaning. I could feel it trying to settle into me, trying to lodge itself somewhere beneath the surface of my thoughts. And I knew with bone-deep certainty that if I let it, if I allowed myself to accept it as truth, then I wouldn't be able to fight anymore. I took another step back. Monroe smiled. It was barely there, a fractional shift at the corner of his mouth, but it sent something cold crawling down my spine. I had seen this before, not the expression itself, but the intention behind it. The same way Kalen had smiled when I asked about the cocoons, the same way Langley had whispered you were always meant to be just before he... I stopped. Monroe's head tilted slightly. "You remember now." Not a question, a statement. And that was when I knew. I had left the observation chamber. I had followed Langley into the medical bay. I had stood in front of the cocoons, watching as they shifted, as they responded, as they recognized us. But I didn't remember leaving. I didn't remember what had happened after. My pulse pounded in my ears. "What did you do to me?" Monroe's smile remained. "You are already changing." The walls around me felt further away than they had seconds ago, the corridor stretching, deepening, the angles warping at the edges of my vision, not changing, finalizing. I could feel it now, the correction, the slow unraveling of everything I had been, the memories I had anchored myself to, the mission briefing, the first time I had set foot on this station, The moment I had heard that the Valiant had returned, they weren't solid anymore. They weren't mine. Monroe lifted his hand, and the pressure in my skull intensified, the world pulling in around me like the final stitches being drawn on a wound that was never meant to heal. I staggered. I was changing. And the worst part, I didn't even know what I was changing into. The station was collapsing. Not physically, not in any way the sensors could detect, but reality itself was bending, reforming, adjusting to accommodate something that didn't belong here, something that had never belonged here, something that included me. I stumbled, my balance betraying me as the corridor stretched, the walls pulling away at angles that didn't exist. Monroe was still standing in front of me, his posture unchanged, his face frozen in that too-perfect expression. But the space between us had grown. Not distance, space. The concept of where I was, of what I was, had begun to fragment. I forced a breath into my lungs. Was I even breathing? Did I still need to? The sensation felt distant, mechanical, like something I was remembering rather than experiencing. "You are already changing," Monroe said, and the words weren't just sound. They pressed into my thoughts, into the spaces between my understanding, reinforcing the truth that I was slipping. No, I wasn't going to let this happen. I locked my muscles, dug my fingers into the seams of my uniform, focused on the pressure of fabric against skin. Skin. My skin. It was still mine, wasn't it? I flexed my fingers. They obeyed. Good. You think resistance is strength, Monroe continued, stepping closer, though I never saw him move. It is not. The corridor behind me was gone, not destroyed, not collapsed, just gone. A smooth expanse of nothing stretched in its place, an absence so complete that my brain refused to process it. I turned back to Monroe, but there were more of them now. His crew, the ones who had returned. They stood behind him in perfect stillness, their eyes fixed on me, unblinking, unbreathing. "We were not lost," one of them said. Their voices were blending now, overlapping like a chorus, spoken in different octaves of the same tone. "We were found." Their skin was shifting, pulling against their bones in ways that defied anatomy. No, not shifting, finalizing. The details of their faces smoothed, became more symmetrical, more precise. Every imperfection was being erased, every variance corrected. And it was happening to me, too. I could feel it. The subtle shifts in my structure, the quiet adjustments rewriting the blueprint of my existence. A fraction of a degree change in my bone density. A realignment of my retinal curvature. An imperceptible correction to my posture. Becoming. I exhaled sharply and reached for my tablet. My hands shook, but I still had hands, still had control. The moment my fingers met the glass interface, the screen flickered. Just for an instant, the display registering a fluctuation it couldn't identify. And then the words on the screen began to rewrite themselves. Not an error, a correction. I stared as my name shifted in the mission records, the letters twisting, reforming into something close but not quite right. My birth date recalibrated by a decimal margin. The log of my arrival here adjusted by fractions of a second. It was rewriting me. Not just my body, not just my presence, my existence. I dropped the tablet, my breath coming too fast, too shallow. The crew was still watching, still waiting, their bodies refining with each passing second, and I understood now. They hadn't survived whatever had happened to the Valiant. They had been rewritten by it. "You assume we are imperfect," Monroe said, his voice almost gentle, almost pitying. "We are not." The world pulsed around me, a deep, resonant shift. I felt my own mass misalign, just for a fraction of a second. I was slipping. I staggered back. "You're not them." My voice shook, my words falling into the air like loose threads waiting to be woven into something else. "You never were." Monroe tilted his head. "Then tell me, Nathaniel Kessler." He spoke my name wrong, not mispronounced, not distorted, rewritten. A fractional change in syllabic emphasis, a shift in tone that made it sound like something else entirely, something new. He took another step toward me, and I felt it again, that pressure, that deep, terrible sensation that I wasn't just standing on solid ground, but on the surface of a thought too vast to comprehend. A thought that was thinking me back. "You were always meant to be," Monroe said. And for a fraction of a second, I almost believed him. Because the moment he spoke, I remembered. I remembered the launch, the pre-mission evaluations, the briefing. I remembered stepping aboard the station, the weeks of research, the first time I saw the Valiant hanging motionless over the Pacific Recovery Zone. And I remembered the other version of those same events. The ones where the Valiant never returned. The ones where I was never here. The ones where I never existed at all. The memories were layered, overlapping like two competing truths, neither entirely real, neither entirely false. I pressed my fingers against my temples, my skull buzzing with something too large to hold, my thoughts stretching, reshaping, shifting towards some unseen equilibrium. I wasn't just changing, I was being resolved. Monroe reached out. His hand was almost right, the fingers too straight, the knuckles too smooth, the texture of his skin subtly inconsistent. Not flawed, but unfinished. "You are incomplete," he murmured. And suddenly I knew what he meant. I wasn't fully changed yet. I could still fight. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to move, to resist. The effort sent a spike of pressure through my limbs, like pushing through an unseen current. My body wanted to adjust, my mind wanted to accept, but I wasn't ready to let go. Monroe frowned, not in frustration, but in understanding, as if he had seen this before, as if he expected it. "You will understand soon," he said. And then the station around us unraveled. It didn't collapse. It didn't break. It simply ceased, and I fell forward into the nothing waiting beneath it. I was falling. Not through space, not through time, through existence itself. The station had unraveled, peeled away layer by layer, its structure dissolving into the same empty logic that had consumed the Valiant. And I had gone with it, pulled into the breach, into the place that wasn't a place, the absence that had been waiting all along. I should have been terrified, but I wasn't, because the fear wasn't mine anymore. It had been taken, stripped away like everything else, restructured into something else, something that fit the shape of what I was becoming, or rather, what I had always been meant to be. The void around me wasn't darkness, wasn't emptiness. It was filled with something vast, something incomprehensible, something that wasn't a presence but a process, a system, a correction, and I was inside of it. Or, no, not inside, I was part of it. I wasn't falling, I was resolving. Piece by piece, the edges of my existence recalibrated, old definitions overwritten with new ones. I could feel my structure shifting, my body adjusting to fit parameters that had never been mine, but had always been waiting for me to accept them. I flexed my fingers. They obeyed. Good. Except I hadn't moved them. The realization hit like a shockwave, rippling through my mind, forcing me to focus, to cling to myself, to hold on to whatever parts of me were still mine. But what was mine? I searched for my name. Found it. It was wrong. Not misspelled, not lost. Just slightly different. Like a word repeated too many times until it loses its meaning. Nathaniel Kessler. Nathaniel Kessler. Nathan Kessler. Each one felt equally correct. Each one felt equally false. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to latch onto something. A memory. A single, undeniable truth that they hadn't rewritten. The launch. I clung to it, pulled it to the surface of my thoughts, anchored myself in the moment when I had stepped onto the station, when I had been whole, when my name had been mine and the world had made sense. But something was wrong with the memory. The details didn't match. The launch had happened in 20057, but now it was something else. A different year, a different place, a different Kessler. No, that wasn't right. I had always been here, hadn't I? The thoughts slotted into place so smoothly, so perfectly, that for a moment I believed it. And that was when I truly understood what had happened to the Valiant. They had never come home. Not really. They had been corrected. Their ship had vanished for 20 years, its crew lost beyond the edges of known space, trapped in a place where the rules of existence didn't apply. And when they returned, they weren't who they had been. They were who they had been made to be. Their minds had been restructured, their bodies subtly altered, their memories carefully adjusted to fit a version of reality that had never been theirs to begin with. They had become new iterations of themselves, close enough to pass, close enough that they didn't even question it. And now it was happening to me. The void around me shuddered, flexing like a muscle, adapting to my presence, or perhaps molding me to fit into it. I felt myself unraveling, not breaking, not being destroyed, just adjusting, like a number being rounded up to the nearest whole, like a line of code being optimized for efficiency, like a piece being reshaped to fit into the system where it had always belonged. I clenched my jaw. I wasn't going to let them take me. I wasn't going to let them fix me. I reached for the fractures, for the gaps in my thoughts, for the places where the correction hadn't taken hold yet. I pulled at the inconsistencies, the raw edges, the imperfections. Because imperfection was proof of identity, it was proof of self. And that was something they couldn't take unless I let them. The void resisted. It pushed back, pulsing with something cold, something indifferent, something that did not allow for errors. But I wasn't an error. I was human, and humans were messy. Humans were irrational. Humans were flawed. And it was because of those flaws that I knew I was still me. I forced my name back into my mind, forced the real version of it, not the one they had tried to reconstruct. Nathaniel Kessler. That was who I was. That was who I had always been. The void shuddered. Something broke. The pressure inside my skull cracked open like a fault line splitting through bedrock, and suddenly I was falling the other way, not into the void, but out of it. The world reassembled around me in an instant. A corridor, a station, the feel of cold metal beneath my hands. I was back. I gasped, pulling in a lungful of air. Real air, stale and metallic and mine. The emergency lights flickered overhead. Monroe stood in front of me, watching. His expression had changed. Not surprised, not angry, just curious. "You resisted," he said. I pushed myself upright, my muscles weak, trembling. "Yeah," I rasped. "I did." Monroe tilted his head. Behind him, the rest of his crew stood motionless, waiting. Their forms were still shifting, still finalizing. But I wasn't. I had stopped changing, and Monroe saw it. He took a slow step forward. His eyes weren't human anymore. Not really. They were too precise, too exact. "Fascinating," he murmured. I swallowed, my throat raw. "What now?" Monroe didn't answer. He only smiled. A perfect, calculated expression. A choice. And then, without a sound, he and the rest of his crew turned and walked away. Not back to the quarantine chambers, not to any exit. They walked into the corridor and vanished. The station fell silent. The air was still. The emergency alerts stopped. For a long moment I stood there, staring at the place where they had been, my thoughts still raw, my body still mine. Then, slowly, I reached for my tablet. I needed to check the logs. I needed proof. The system booted up. The telemetry data loaded. And every single record of the Valiant's return was gone. I stared at the screen, my breath caught in my chest. No logs, no quarantine reports, no telemetry anomalies. As if none of it had ever happened, as if they had never been here at all. I closed my eyes. Maybe they hadn't. Maybe they never were. Maybe I hadn't been either. The only thing I knew for certain, the only thing I could know, was that I was still here. And for now, that had to be enough.